Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ewan Graham, Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow from the Asia Office of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, which has organized and convened this 9th Fullerton Forum, SLD Sherpa meeting. I'd like to welcome you all. Welcome to the forum. This 9th Fullerton Forum is the latest in a series that we started in 2013 with the support and encouragement of Singapore's Ministry of Defence as a component of the wider IISS Shangri-La Dialogue process. We have also been supported from the beginning by the Fullerton Group, the owner and operator of this historic Fullerton Hotel where we are holding this forum. We are grateful to both MINDEF and the Fullerton Group for their support. Since 2013, the IISS Fullerton Forum, SLD Sherpa meeting, has developed into a vital intersessional activity of the Shangri-La Dialogue process. It's essentially an off-the-record meeting, but from the beginning, it has benefited from the on-the-record keynote addresses delivered by a distinguished series of defence ministers from the region. We are delighted that Singapore's Senior Minister of State for Defence, Mr. Zaqy Mohamad, has agreed to deliver this morning's Fullerton Forum's keynote. When we established the Fullerton Forum 8 years ago, we anticipated that it would serve 3 goals. First, the Fullerton Forum was intended from its start to provide an opportunity for substantive discussions involving selected non-government experts as well as senior officials and officers concerning key regional security matters that needed to be addressed in a multilateral context by the states engaged in the SLD process. These discussions enhance the intellectual underpinnings of the annual Shangri-La Dialogue Summit, where these issues can be taken up more formally in bilateral and multilateral meetings. Second, the Fullerton Forum provides directing and senior staff of the IISS as the convener of the Shangri-La Dialogue with a better understanding of the evolving defence and security concerns that need to be addressed at SLD, and of how the dialogue agenda may be developed with a view to advancing constructive and fruitful discussion of these concerns. Third, the forum was intended from the beginning to strengthen the SLD process by convening senior defence officials and officers with high-level responsibility for defence policy making and defence diplomacy. Interaction between participating states, senior officials and officers at the SLD Sherpa meeting has contributed to effective engagement between their ministers and other principals at the annual Shangri-La Dialogue several months later each year. We're particularly pleased that over the years, many of the national delegations to this forum have taken advantage of the opportunities that it has provided for private bilateral meetings with their counterparts from the other SLD participant countries. This year, the Fullerton Forum is taking place in very different circumstances from normal. As you know, we had to take the difficult decision just 1 week ago to switch from a physical to a hybrid format. All but one of the speakers who will present opening remarks will now do so virtually. Overall, no fewer than 20 of the countries that regularly participate in the Shangri-La Dialogue, as well as the European Union, are represented at this Fullerton Forum by virtual or physical delegates, or both. We are also pleased to welcome virtual delegates from the Integrated Area Defence System and the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, and as special guests of the IISS, Latvia and Sweden. We appreciate the efforts by those countries to participate in this Fullerton Forum, despite the difficult circumstances. And that includes significant time differences for those in Europe and North America. Among a good-sized cohort of delegates in the room are senior staff members from the IISS Asia Office, experts from other think tanks and universities in Singapore, and representatives of Singapore's Ministry of Defence. Unfortunately, bilateral meetings cannot be a part of this Fullerton Forum, but we hope that participant countries' delegations nevertheless benefit from the opportunities provided for airing their national perspectives on major security issues of the day and for engaging in discussions on these. This Fullerton Forum will, we intend, help participating national defence establishments as well as the IISS to prepare for the 19th IISS Shangri-La Dialogue, which we will convene from the 4th to the 6th of June. As you know, we were unable to convene SLD last year, and we intend that the dialogue in June will be an important event that relaunches the SLD series. We intend that our exchanges here in the Fullerton Hotel over the next day and a half will establish the foundations for a fruitful 19th Shangri-La Dialogue this year, in just 4.5 months' time. We hope that you will all find this Fullerton Forum to be worthwhile and productive, and that all delegates will feel able to take an active part in the discussions. I would also like to share some housekeeping matters relating to safe management measures that we have put in place for this year's forum. In this room, we are divided into 3 zones. Zone A is composed of delegates around this hollow square table. Within this delegate zone, we are subdivided into 2 cohorts, one cohort wearing white lanyards, the second cohort wearing yellow lanyards. Zone B is to my left, and 2 cohorts are wearing dark blue and burgundy respectively. Zone C, I think that's actually to my left, is again divided into 2 cohorts, one wearing orange lanyards, while the second cohort is wearing lime green. This means that only those wearing the same color lanyards can intermingle with one another. That's a very important point. This segregation will apply for so long as we are meeting here in the ballroom, outside the lobby area, and later for lunch at the town restaurant. And we ask that all participants kindly respect this for the duration of the forum. Coffee breaks will be served to us when we are seated, but you are, of course, free to take telephone calls at any time outside the ballroom or visit the restrooms. The exit doors are clearly located at the rear. Last but not least, you will see a safety instruction card on your table with regards to safe management measures. Please study that if you haven't already. One final housekeeping point. Delegates who wish to ask questions throughout Fullerton Forum should raise their nameplates in the usual manner, which will be an aid to those moderating each session. My colleague, Dr. Tim Huxley, the Executive Director of IISS Asia, will shortly introduce our keynote speaker, Senior Minister of State, Zaqy Mohamad, whose address will mark the formal state of this Fullerton Forum SLD Sherpa meeting. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, delegates to the 9th IISS Fullerton Forum, the Shangri-La Dialogue Sherpa meeting, and also to the accompanying officials who are here. Whether you're in the room or watching the event through the live stream. I'm Tim Huxley, Executive Director of the Asia Office of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I'm very pleased indeed to welcome you to the opening session of the 9th IISS Fullerton Forum SLD Sherpa meeting, which features the keynote address for the meeting by Singapore's Senior Minister of State for Defence, Mr. Zaqy Mohamad. The keynote address at the Fullerton Forum has always played an important role in terms of setting the scene for subsequent discussions in the main sessions, which will start later this morning. We in the IISS are delighted that SMS Zaqy has graciously agreed to speak to us this morning. Mr. Zaqy Mohamad entered politics in 2006. He's a Member of Parliament for Choa Chu Kang constituency. He was appointed as Senior Minister of State for both Defence and Manpower in August 2020. He's also been Deputy Leader of the House since August 2020. SMS Zaqy, thank you for joining us this morning. We look forward to your remarks. The floor is now yours, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Huxley. A very good morning to all our distinguished guests in Singapore. A very good afternoon and a very good evening to our guests who are joining us from overseas. Welcome to the 9th Shangri-La Dialogue Sherpa Meeting 2021. I'm honored to deliver the keynote address for this iteration of the Sherpa meeting. We are conducting our Sherpa meeting with a hybrid modality for the first time, given the extraordinary circumstances. Our Singapore-based guests are with us here in the Fullerton Hotel, while our overseas guests are dialing in virtually. I trust that we will still be able to have a substantial discussion in preparation for the Shangri-La Dialogue later this year. As always, the plenary sessions topics for this year's Sherpa meeting cover a wide range of current issues. There are planned discussions on COVID-19 and regional security, maritime security and international law, strategic uses of emerging technologies and evolving modalities of regional defense, as well as security cooperation. These discussions will help to ensure that we can continue to safely navigate the increasingly global complex environment, especially given the COVID-19 pandemic. Before we venture into the specific issues and plenary sessions, I'd like to share some thoughts on the continued relevance of multilateral dialogue and cooperation, particularly in the face of geopolitical tensions and transnational challenges such as the COVID-19 pandemic. This Sherpa meeting underscores the necessity of continued dialogue and constructive exchanges in fostering strategic trust, and mutual understanding. Notwithstanding our differences, we face common security threats that governments and defense establishments can work together to address and to overcome. I hope to provide some perspectives and set the context for further discussions among our distinguished guests and panelists. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, we were already seeing increasing pushback against multilateralism. In many societies, a growing number of people saw the multilateral system as a key driver behind the erosion of national sovereignty, economic dislocation, and a widening income gap. Others viewed the system and its accompanying institutions and rules as rigid, archaic, and restrictive. Collectively, these sentiments have led some to conclude that the country's national interests were best served through unilateral or bilateral means, unencumbered by multilateral structures. This unexpected onslaught of the COVID-19 pandemic has accentuated these domestic forces, exposing the vulnerabilities and insecurities of each society. Jobs were lost, food supplies were affected, medical infrastructure came under stress, and globally, the death toll is staggering. According to the World Health Organization, COVID-19 has infected close to 100 million people and caused the deaths of over 2 million people. In the face of such an unprecedented public health crisis, it is not surprising that many countries have turned inwards, focusing on their own immediate domestic needs, closing borders, and erecting protectionistic barriers. In May last year, the World Trade Organization documented an increase in COVID-19 related export restrictions. In particular, countries imposed export restrictions on various protective equipment or PPE, medicine, and medical equipment. Some countries also imposed restrictions on food exports. And as we know, international travel took a major hit. A significant number of countries implemented travel restrictions since early last year to prevent and minimize the virus from spreading into the local communities. Many countries had also imposed strict lockdowns, curfews, and movement curbs to minimize community transmission, some facing their second or more waves of infections. These measures to curb the spread of the pandemic have led to a significant drop in global trade, disrupted supply chain networks, as well as reduced demand for services. With fewer job opportunities, there has been a worldwide increase in unemployment across all sectors. And given these developments, the World Bank has estimated that there could be 150 million more people in extreme poverty by 2021. Over the last 2 decades, the world has already experienced significant public health on at least 5 occasions. You had SARS, you had MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, Ebola, the avian and swine flus. Now, COVID-19 has surpassed these diseases in terms of scale and in terms of impact. The grim reality is that this pandemic would likely not be the last global health emergency of its kind. We are only as strong as our weakest link, and it is crucial for countries to work together to coordinate responses and enhance global preparedness. Now, encouragingly, despite the pandemic and global disruptions, countries have also found creative means, they've leveraged technology to sustain interactions and to also share best practices. And these range from operational experiences to more technical and medical aspects of dealing with the virus. Scientists from around the world have shared important COVID-19 related data. For example, since the first genome sequence of the COVID-19 virus was published by Chinese researchers in January 2020, other scientists have stepped forward and shared thousands of viral genomes from around the world. This sharing of different COVID-19 variants has helped researchers trace the origin of COVID-19 outbreaks within their own countries and pinpoint instances of community transmission. Now, the sharing of genetic data of the virus also aided the swift development of diagnostic tests. And this was crucial in the early stage of the pandemic when countries were ramping up their domestic testing capabilities to detect positive COVID-19 cases. Singapore was one country that also benefited from the sharing of this information. We were able to develop our own test kits and in turn provided some assistance to our friends overseas. And likewise, many countries have stepped up their assistance. Countries like the US and Australia had provided ventilators and essential supplies to partners. Others, such as China, had provided masks, medical supplies, and essential supplies to partners, and equipment to other countries. International cooperation also contributed to the speed at which COVID-19 vaccines were produced. For vaccine distribution, we have seen the establishment of the COVAX facility, which aims to obtain and fairly distribute 2 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccines by the end of 2021. The COVAX facility has received the support of around 97 self-financing participants and will be essential in ensuring vaccine access to 92 lower-income countries. Vaccinations will help to save lives, lay the path to global recovery and allow the resumption of international trade and travel, which would continue to be hampered if COVID-19 is allowed to spread uncontrollably. Now, these examples point us to an important lesson. No country can hope to overcome and tackle this global pandemic alone. The world that we live in today is increasingly interconnected. The global community will not fully recover from this pandemic without coordinated responses to curb its spread, keep critical supply chains open, and rebuild economies. Protectionist and unilateral actions are ultimately short-term solutions that will not be able to address long-term problems. Indeed, in early 2020, Singapore and New Zealand initiated a joint ministerial statement to affirm our shared commitment to maintaining open supply chains during the pandemic. The statement now has a total of 12 signatories, including Brunei, Laos, and Canada. At the same time, amidst the pandemic, issues that threaten the security of all countries persist. These include cybersecurity, terrorism, piracy, and climate change, just to name a few. I want to briefly touch on two issues. First, the threat of terrorism remains high, and we need to stay vigilant. Last year, there were high-profile terrorist attacks in Europe, in countries such as Austria and France. Furthermore, due to movement restrictions, people are spending more time on the internet, and extremist groups have exploited these opportunities to amplify their research, their reach, and export radical ideologies. In Southeast Asia, militant groups have increased their efforts to radicalize and recruit new members through social media and internet forums. Second, we have also seen increasing incidents of cyber attacks targeting both public and private institutions. Cyber attacks have relatively low barriers to entry and are not constrained by international boundaries. We can expect cyber-related threats to increase. At the state and institutional levels, these attacks have revealed vulnerabilities in our digital infrastructure, and at the individual level, these attacks have also put at risk sensitive personal information. As states seek to secure their networks, systems, and infrastructures, we should keep in mind that no country, big or small, can fully insulate itself from these vulnerabilities without isolating itself from the rest of the world. Now, it is not an overstatement to say that multilateral dialogue and cooperation have become even more salient today than before. More specifically, defense establishments have a role to play in strengthening multilateral frameworks to address these common security challenges. Now, here are three suggestions to ponder over. First, our armed forces and defense officials could find ways to exchange best practices and experience in areas of common interest, such as military medicine and chemical, biological, and radiological expertise in anticipation of future threats. Regionally, the ADMM and ADMM Plus provides a useful avenue to establish and support relevant initiatives such as the network of ASEAN CBR defense experts. It is also important to maintain constructive dialogue and build relations through platforms such as the Shangri-La Dialogue and Sherpa meetings to strengthen mutual confidence and trust during these challenging times. Second, defense establishments could explore reciprocal arrangements and develop safe protocols for armed forces to interact, train, and cooperate to foster trust and operational effectiveness. Even with the challenge of COVID-19, navies from 10 countries were able to safely conduct the last iteration of Exercise RIMPAC in 2020. The exercise was planned virtually and thereafter successfully conducted with an at-sea only construct, which minimized the risk of COVID-19 transmission among participating forces. The Republic of Singapore Navy participated in the exercise and was in charge of directing other ships within its task force for all anti-surface and anti-submarine exercise trials. Additionally, we could promote greater coordination and encourage information sharing on common security threats. To that end, we will continue to support regional counter-terrorism efforts such as our IISS initiative through information sharing of data and insights. Third, our armed forces and defense establishments could continue to support efforts to strengthen the international order and enhance practical cooperation. Now, this is especially pertinent to emerging domains such as artificial intelligence and cybersecurity, where the development of norms will promote responsible state behavior, build confidence, and foster international stability. At the same time, countries could work together to keep our air and sea lines open and guard against piracy to ensure the free movement of goods and supplies. Notably, to enhance maritime security, regional countries have established and remain committed to joint initiatives such as the Malacca Straits Patrol and the Sulu Sea Trilateral Patrol. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a significant impact on public health, the global economy, as well as the way in which countries and people interact with one another. We should continue to guard against tendencies to focus on domestic challenges to the detriment of more coordinated global responses, which remain vital to effectively tackle common security threats. Indeed, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown yet again the importance of cooperation beyond our national borders, presenting numerous opportunities for governments and defense establishments to work together. Our collective participation at this Sherpa meeting is testament to our continued commitment to multilateralism. I wish you a successful and productive conference ahead. Thank you and have a good day. Thank you.
SMS, thank you very much for your wide-ranging keynote address. We really appreciated that, and particularly the way that you ended your keynote address by raising some suggestions for enhanced practical cooperation amongst regional defense establishments. I'm sure that there are going to be some questions from our delegates in the room. And I'd like to give them the chance to raise their hands and direct questions towards you now. Dr. Samir Puri from the International Institute for Strategic Studies Asia Office.
Senior Minister, I want to thank you very much for your keynote address. And I wanted to ask you a question about national resilience in the face of the pandemic, something that Singapore has proven highly adept at achieving. Specifically, I wanted to ask you about the lessons for national defense more broadly around the hypothetical weaponization of a future virus, thinking both about state and non-state threats. You mentioned very pertinently terrorism. Are there lessons currently being learned around national resilience that could apply to this type of threat in the future, do you think?
Well, certainly. I think to some extent, there are two sorts of approaches that we could take. The first, I think we were quite fortunate in Singapore here, where we were able to learn from our experience in SARS. We were able to set up, both on the defense side and the civilian side, network of medical expertise and health expertise to be able to deal with pandemics and how to respond to them. At the same time, we were able to build infrastructure, being ready to tackle the next viral, I would say, pandemic such as SARS. However, the difference, I suppose, with this pandemic was that we didn't expect the impact and scale to be very different. Could it be replicated? I suppose you could, and that's why within ASEAN, Singapore sponsors the CBR experts dialogue as well, to share expertise and to further develop, and further develop resilience from a defense perspective, in which I think how we collaborate and to protect our borders are very important. That's one, from a security perspective. The second aspect of resilience would be your infrastructure and healthcare system, and that's where the second approach comes in, where how we deal with research, sharing our expertise, building a network of experts, not just within country, but also around, will help us to put together a response. So as I shared in my speech earlier, for example, the moment we got the DNA sequence from China, we were also able to adapt it quite quickly using our own research to put forth testing cases, testing technology, for example, to rapidly pick out cases within the community. And so the response, I think, is important, and how quickly we can move on that will also determine how quickly we can also advise the community and put in place response measures. Now, the third area in which I think is important, but not necessarily in defense, but I think from a social defense perspective, the community needs to also buy into this. Now, we've seen responses being very different in different countries. So in some countries, in terms of community acceptance of certain measures such as the wearing of masks, social distancing, was a lot easier to implement. So in this case, I think locally within some of these states that were able to do a quick lockdown, had citizens adhere to it, such as in Singapore, we were able to manage it a lot better. Now, when you look at some other countries where acceptance was a bit harder, then control becomes a lot more difficult. So on one hand, on the defense side, you could talk about your border controls, you could talk about mitigating the spread at certain levels, but at the same time, once it goes into the community, how we respond to it as a society also matters. But of course, there are different types of threats, and I'm just using the current COVID-19 pandemic as an example, but there could be more severe ones which we have to prepare for, and each one probably needs a different approach.
Thank you very much,
Thank
SMS. James Crabtree from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy.
Senior Minister, thank you very much for your remarks. You mentioned a number of multilateral initiatives in which Singapore has played a leading role. The supply chains initiative, also COVAX on viruses. I wondered, thinking back to Prime Minister Lee's article in Foreign Affairs on his view of the evolving great power competition in the region, what you and others in Singapore have learned through this process of, in particular, the involvement of the US and China in these multilateral arrangements, given that in many of these, the involvement of those two powers has been complicated. And I suppose I wondered whether you or Singapore in general had advice for other middle powers and smaller powers in the region from what you've learned over the last year about the engagement and management of the two big elephants in the room.
Well, one thing this current pandemic has also taught us is that no country can go at it alone. I think a lot of the developments that we've had, not just in Singapore but around the world, in terms of how we came up with the vaccines, how we dealt with measures, how we did quick information exchanges so that communities and countries and governments could provide an adequate response, has been really through multilateral platforms, whether through WHO or other platforms, such as COVAX, have shown that collaboration, cooperation is very important. So I think the continued use of our multilateral platforms will be very important for us moving forward, and this has shown to be the case, whether it's to deal with supply chain, whether it's to deal with the health pandemic, whether it's to deal with even research and R&D in terms of response. But I do agree with you, the current situation within US and China, I think creates a bit of tension within the region, but we can't afford the Asia region to be split. I think we've seen good cooperation over the years, over decades, within this rules-based order to see progress within Asia. And it will be sad to see all this dismantled, if we were disconnected, polarized to two parts. And I hope that with the new administration, I hope we could see better cooperation. So to some extent, I think competition is okay, can be managed, but I think, I hope that competition does not result in conflict. That's where I see a threat in terms of the Asian region being polarized if we are forced to choose. So ultimately, I prefer inclusive and open platform or an open relationship with all our countries so that we can all prosper together.
Thank you very much, sir. Aaron Connolly from IISS Asia.
Thank you, Dr. Huxley. Senior Minister of State, you mentioned many multilateral forums, the IISS Initiative, the ASEAN IISS Initiative, the Joint Ministerial Statement between Singapore and New Zealand. One mini-lateral initiative that did not come up in your speech, I don't think, was the quadrilateral security dialogue between Japan, Australia, India, and the US. I was just wondering if you could share with us Singapore's perspective on that initiative and whether or not Singapore believes there is a constructive role that the Quad can play in regional security.
Sure. I think we have multiple platforms as it is. I mean, we welcome various initiatives, but if you look at our ADMM Plus platforms too, we do have many of our, I would say, other governments and countries from within the region and outside the region collaborating on defense matters and defense issues too. So we welcome perspectives from all parties, and we are not, choosing one over the other.
Thank you. I can see a name board raised over there. I'm sorry, sir, I can't see your name or your face clearly from here.
Good morning, Minister. My name is Leonard Sebastian from RSIS. Minister, I'd like to ask your impressions of the nature of cooperation between the Home Affairs Ministry and the Defense Ministry. I think one of the great challenges in the context of COVID-19 has been the division of labor between these two ministries. I can see that there will be challenges, especially in the context of our neighbors in Southeast Asia, in terms of getting the balance right between the work of these two critical institutions in helping to curb the pandemic, but also to support the population in terms of meeting the challenges ahead. Can you share what is the Singapore experience in terms of getting the balance right?
Well, ultimately for us, I mean, if you look at what one of the early responses we had was to set up the Multi-Ministry Task Force, MMTF. And even till today, the task force is still in action, on top of the pandemic, taking advice from experts. So ultimately, I think you got to look at it from a public health perspective as a start. When you deal with whether it's interior or exterior defense, I think we just got to look at who's best placed to deal with particular issues. So even for the SAF, for example, while defense is still a top priority for us in security, we also leveraged on some of our own expertise, deploying manpower, for example, to help manage the dorms when they were short of manpower down to manage the pandemic there, as well as lending our expertise in defense science to help with the bio part, in terms of developing, whether it's testing technology or even testing of vaccines today, effectiveness. So there are different divisions of labor, while Home Affairs continues with, managing inflows and outflows of human traffic, for example, and infections. So these are ways in which we control borders, but at the same time using strengths from each side. So, but ultimately what's important is that every function of government is fully focused on public health to ensure that the community remains safe and the country remains safe. At the same time as well, I think there is also scope for us to also work with partners to see how we can also enhance what we can offer to the country and the region.
Thank you, SMS. Dr. Lynn Kwok from IISS Asia.
Thank you very much, Dr. Huxley. Hello, SMS Zaqy. You talked about the importance of multilateralism for both the ability to handle the pandemic, but also to tackle geopolitical tensions. in a couple of days, the United States will be seeing a new administration, and that administration is said to be focused more on democracy as well as human rights. How do you think that's going to be affecting the US administration's ability to forge deeper as well as more extensive ties with allies and partners in Southeast Asia, given that some of the countries in Southeast Asia are not liberal democracies and several have sketchy human rights records? Thank you.
Well, it's not the first time we've seen change of governments to some extent. So countries in Asia have always adapted, whether it's a Republican government or Democrat government. I think it's still important to be able to manage relationships to ensure that their focus remains here in Asia. The US plays a very important role out here. For decades, they've helped us build a rules-based order here, build many networks and connections, and created stability in the region. Certainly with the changing dynamics between the US and China, and US and China out here in the region, I think all the more how we balance the tensions between both and how it may affect the architecture, I think has to be a focus for us here in Asia. So do we want a united ASEAN, for example, or do we think ASEAN should take sides? That's a big question, I think, on everyone's minds. But all the more, we need to encourage both parties to work together, and all parties, in fact, not just the US and China, but all parties to work together to see how we can come out of this more, I would say, progressively. There will be differences, I suppose, in ideologies and so forth, but there has to be a common goal in terms of creating stability and order and, and manage the security threats in the region. Because beyond some of these, there are also other I would say, important security elements that we need to tackle as well together. So if I talk about cyber threats, terrorism, the COVID pandemic, for example, there are already many other threats that we need to deal with, and so there will be differences, but we need to also put priority on some of these things, which I think could affect the stability of the region. I think that's very important for us to look at too.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kwok. We have an online question from one of our virtual delegates. The question is about how useful Singapore's MINDEF has found the ADMM and ADMM plus mechanisms in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Has MINDEF been able to use those linkages within ADMM, ADMM plus as part of a regional response?
Sure. So to two extent, one from a direct perspective, the linkages are certainly very important because the relationships have still got to go on. We've done joint training still within ASEAN and partners to ensure that security is not hampered despite governments being a bit, I would say, a bit more focused on the COVID pandemic rather than some of the defense issues. So at the same time as well, the threat of counterterrorism, for example, and cybersecurity threats have not gone away. And this is where ADMM still has a role to play and where we found the linkages and sharing of intel very useful. In fact, for all of us here, I think all being here at this platform also shows the importance of this linkage within ASEAN and our partners to discuss some of these key issues as well that we need to tackle in the months ahead. So while we are focused on the pandemic, I think there is still a role for us to not forget our core requirements in terms of taking care of our security threats that needs to be taken care of in the meantime. So I look forward to the Shangri-La dialogue in which we can strengthen further a lot of the issues and agenda that we have on the ADMM and ADMM Plus, and certainly look forward to greater collaboration ahead.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for just one more question, and it's from Dr. Greg Austin from the IISS.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Minister, for your presentation and putting cybersecurity up there as a key issue alongside terrorism presents a host of challenges. You mentioned the need for defense organizations to try to stimulate some multilateral responses. it would be interesting if you could elaborate a little on how you see that. Do we concentrate first perhaps on regional approaches or global approaches? Do we go with like-minded? And given that cyberspace is already weaponized and that some countries see themselves in an intelligence war with other countries, given the sensitivities of all of that, would you like to elaborate a little on the potential and way forward perhaps in that area? Thanks.
Well, on the cyber front, certainly developments are wide and aplenty. I mean, beyond just cyber, you're also dealing with artificial intelligence and other users of technology, either to take down systems or destroy infrastructure, or just as you've seen with non-state actors too, meddling with I would say national security matters, even elections. So these are threats in which countries are looking to see how to best handle them, and identifying perpetrators is not easy as well. So you do need a link, a network of like-minded countries working together in tandem to try to triangulate some of these threats. At the same time as well, I think it's important to continue to share best practices, because I think it's important where one country is hit, you're able to share quickly so that we can all react a lot more quickly and use our collective know-how to understand some of these threats. The challenge with many of these technology threats are that you need to respond a lot quicker than say you don't have the line of sight in terms of how this would escalate. So to some extent, you might get hit by one attack and you might be followed on by subsequent attacks without you even guessing where it's coming from, because you have both state and non-state actors as well, so you're not sure where it's coming from. So the quicker you triangulate it, the quicker you're able to pick out and realize what's happening. I think that's even more important. And the challenge would probably be that the capabilities of different countries are also would probably differ. I mean, it depends on capacity and depends on expertise. So all the more like-minded countries should come together to lend expertise, especially in the area of defense. And there is also scope, I think, in terms of how we define the ethical use of such tech too, and how we define that rules-based order. So in the physical space, I think we're a lot clearer in terms of how rules-based order works, right? But in the cyberspace today, I think it's a bit more gray, and I think there's a lot more scope to see how we can use this opportunity and platforms to have deeper discussions on areas of collaboration and two, ethical use of such technologies.
Senior Minister of State, thank you so much again for your excellent keynote address. It was a wonderful way to start off this 9th Fullerton Forum SLD Sherpa meeting, a fantastic introduction to some of the topics that we'll be discussing in more detail over the next day and a half. And thank you especially for responding to that very wide range of questions, and for doing that so thoroughly and frankly. We really appreciate that. An excellent start to the Fullerton Forum, and we're indebted to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.